Hello everyone, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to our webinar today all about maternity pay in Sage 50 Payroll. My name's Duncan, I'm your host and presenter, and I am joined by my colleague Alice, who's standing by in the background, ready and waiting to answer your questions. Let's now take a look at what we'll cover in the webinar. So I'll start things off with a brief introduction to statutory maternity pay, including some of the qualifying conditions and a timeline of key dates. We'll then go into some practical demonstrations. So I'll show you a few ways to record maternity details in Sage 50 Payroll, which will then automatically calculate the statutory maternity pay due. We'll then take a look at adjusting your employees' payments to accommodate the SMP, and we'll look at the make-up basic option as well as manual adjustments. And we'll look at reclaiming statutory payments, which is one of your month-end tasks and involves submitting an EPS to HMRC. I'm going to finish with some top troubleshooting tips, including a very common scenario that people come across when dealing with SMP. And we will stick around at the end of the webinar to give you the chance to read through any questions or to ask your final questions before we wrap things up. So that's what we've got in store for you. Let's get things underway with our introduction to statutory maternity pay. So what is SMP? Well, it's short for statutory maternity pay, and it is a payment made by employers to their employees who qualify for the payment when they're taking time off work to have a baby. Statutory maternity pay is paid for up to 39 weeks, and there are two different rates of pay that apply. So for the first 6 weeks, employees will get the higher rate of SMP, which is 90% of their average weekly earnings. And then for the remaining 33 weeks, they get the standard rate of SMP, which for the current tax year is £184.03 per week, or 90% of the average weekly earnings if that's lower. And that statutory rate would tend to increase at the start of each tax year, so we would expect that to go up from the 6th of April 2025. Now, to get the payment, the employee needs to meet the qualifying conditions. So just to run through the eligibility on the slide just here, and you can read more about the eligibility on the gov.uk website. An employee must be on your payroll in the qualifying week, which is the 15th week before the expected week of childbirth. They need to give you the correct notice, so 15 weeks before the due date to notify that they're taking leave and that they want the pay, and 28 days notice of when they want the SMP payment to start. They need to provide proof that they're pregnant, which is usually the MAP-B1 certificate from the doctor or midwife. They need to have been continuously employed by you for at least 26 weeks up to any day in the qualifying week. And their average earnings need to be at least £123 per week in the 8-week relevant period, which is the period that leads up to that qualifying week. So assuming those conditions are met, the employee qualifies for the payment. But let's just visualize some of the key dates on a timeline. And we're going to be working back from the due date, also known as the expected week of confinement, or EWC. So working back from the EWC, if we go back 15 weeks, that takes us to the qualifying week, which is a really important date when it comes to SMP legislation. And then counting back another 26 weeks takes you to the latest start date for an employee to qualify for this payment. So they need to have been employed at least 26 weeks before the qualifying week. The 8-week period that leads up to the qualifying week is where the average weekly earnings are calculated. Now, this will determine whether an employee qualifies for the payment in the first place. So it needs to be £123 or more, and also determines the higher rate of statutory maternity pay, which will be 90% of those average earnings. A couple of other key dates to be aware of. The earliest date that maternity leave can begin is usually 11 weeks before the EWC, before the due date. The exception being if the baby arrives earlier than 11 weeks before the due date, in which case the SMP will start the day after the baby is born. And for employees who are currently off work with a pregnancy-related sickness, if they're on sick pay and they get to 4 weeks before the due date, at that point, under the legislation, they need to transfer to SMP. So if they hadn't already moved on to SMP, that is the point at which they would do so if they have a pregnancy-related sickness. So those are the key dates, and you'll see where these are shown in the program when you set up the maternity pay. But before we go into that demo, I just want to briefly cover reclaiming statutory payments. Now, statutory parental payments, maternity, paternity, adoption, shared parental pay, and bereavement pay are all mostly funded by the government. And the way that that works is that the employer pays out the payment, but then reclaims an amount from HMRC. Now, most employers can reclaim 92% of statutory parental payments. But if you qualify for small employers relief, you can claim back a bit more. You would get back 103% of the statutory parental payment. And that's all done at the end of a tax month when it's time to pay your tax and national insurance. You'd usually qualify for small employers relief if your total Class 1 national insurance contributions, that's employee plus employer, for the tax year before the qualifying or matching week were £45,000 or less. And if you do qualify, you do need to set up your software so that the correct amount is reclaimed when you process these payments. So before we move on to setting up SMP, I do want to show you where you can set up small employers relief and how you can check your total national insurance contributions. So just going to bring the slides down and do a quick demo in Sage 50 Payroll. So best way to find your total national insurance contributions is to run the P32 report for the previous tax year. It's really simple to do. First thing to do is to change your process date to the last day of the previous tax year. So in my case, it's the 5th of April, 2024. And then you would click OK to save that process date. And then to run the P32 report, I'm just going to look through these payroll links here on the left-hand side. And you can see there is a direct link to P32 report. Now, normally you'd run this at the end of the month and you would run it for an individual month, but we're going to run it for the full year. So I've entered from 1 to 12, being the tax month numbers. And that will then show me my P32 for the previous tax year, ending 5th of April 2024. And it's the value against item 4, the gross national insurance that you need to check. And I can see in my example that this is less than £45,000, which means that I would qualify for small employers relief in the current tax year. So now that I've checked that figure, I can close out of the report and set my process date back to the current pay date, which for me will be the end of this month. And then you would go to the company tasks and then into settings. And if you check on the details tab, you'll see that there's a tick box on the right-hand side, just here, eligible for small employers relief. And you would need to make sure it's ticked if you are eligible, or that it's cleared if you're not. Now, this is something that we recommend that you check at the start of each tax year. So I've already done this check and I've already selected this box as I'm eligible, but always worth checking again before you process any statutory parental payment. So I'm going to click OK, which will save my company settings. And we're all set up, ready to reclaim our SMP when we come to process it. So that's just a bit of an introduction and some of the legislation around SMP. What we're going to move on to next is to record some maternity details in the program. Now, when you come to do this, there's two things that you'll need. So first of all, you'll need to know the date that your employee wants to start their maternity leave and statutory maternity pay. And the second thing you'll need is the medical evidence, usually the MAP-B1 certificate, which confirms the baby's due date. Now, once you have that information, you have everything that you need to set it up in Sage 50 Payroll, and I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do this in the next demo. So let's just bring those slides down again. I'll just go full screen for you. I'm just going to return to my payroll tasks. And the first way to enter the maternity details that I'm going to show you is by using the recording maternity link, which is found in this section here on the left-hand side. Now notice that it's grayed out at the moment. I can't select it, and that's because the first thing I need to do is to highlight the employee that's taken some maternity leave. So in my case, it's the first employee in my list. I can then look in my links and click the recording maternity option. Or if you've got a small screen and you can't see these links, you'll find the same option if you go to the employee tasks within the tasks on the left-hand side. So you could also click recording maternity from here. Now, when you click on that option, sometimes you'll see a pop-up message telling you that there are already maternity details entered. And I'm going to cover that a little bit later on in the webinar, but it's really important to understand why that pops up and what you would need to do. But in this example, this is the first time I've ever set up SMP for this employee. So it's brought up the quick SMP screen, and I would just need to fill in the relevant details. First thing to do then is to select the box to confirm I've received the medical evidence. So I've got the MAP-B1 certificate. And then in the box underneath, we would enter the baby's due date, the expected date of birth, which in my example is the 25th of September. You would then click the button to check entitlement, and Payroll will do some checks in the background and will indicate whether the qualifying conditions have been met. So what we can see on the right-hand side is that we've received the evidence. So we've ticked the box confirming that. The employee has worked for long enough. So their start date was at least 26 weeks before the qualifying week. And the employee earns enough. So at least £123 in that relevant 8-week period. The other date that we need to enter is the employee's last day of work. And any SMP payment will begin the day following that date. Now, they may not actually be physically at work. They might have taken some annual leave before starting their official maternity leave. And if that is the case, you would treat their last day of annual leave as the last day of work. And in this particular example, the employee has worked and will be working up to Friday, the 20th of September. So that will be the last day of work. And it means that the SMP payment will begin from the 21st of September. Now, you can also fill in the actual date of birth if you know what it is, if the baby's been born, and the employee's return to work date, again, if they've confirmed that information. But these can be left blank when it comes to setting up SMP, and you can return to fill in this information at a later date. Now, because we've got the details entered, the SMP entitlement has been calculated. So this is shown in the bottom right-hand corner, and we can see that this employee is entitled to 6 weeks of SMP at the higher rate, and that's £415.39, which is 90% of the employee's average weekly earnings. And that will be followed by 33 weeks at the standard rate, which for the current tax year is £184.03 per week. We could also see information about the average earnings. So the calculated average earnings is this figure here. And if you want to check or override those average earnings for any reason, you can click this button for earnings during set period. And that will then show you which historical payments have been used in the calculation and the average earnings calculated from those payments. You've then got the key dates. So the due date we've provided. The start of the 15th week before the baby's due is the qualifying week. So in this case, it was the 9th of June. The latest start date to qualify for SMP was the 23rd of December. And then we've got the set period where the average earnings is calculated, and the earliest date that leave could start in this scenario, which is 11 weeks before the baby's due. got the last day of work, which we've entered, and if they take the full 39 weeks, we'll have the last day of the maternity pay period. So the last day of paid maternity leave. They can take further unpaid maternity leave up to 52 weeks in total if they wish. Only other thing to point out here are the special circumstances. So you wouldn't usually need to use these. One of them, though, is if the maternity pay period started early due to an early birth of the child. So if it has to start earlier than 11 weeks before the baby was due, you would just need to tick this box to indicate why the last day of work was that earlier date. You can also record if it started due to sickness and they've transferred from SSP to SMP, and you can record any periods of a trade dispute. So if they've been on strike at any point between these dates, you would enter the number of weeks, which could affect the length of service requirement. But I don't need to enter anything here. I can go ahead and save the information, and a really useful feature is you can print a summary of this information just using this print option at the bottom, and you'll get a report that looks something like this. So confirming the qualifying conditions, stating the average earnings, listing all of the key dates, and then showing the statutory pay entitlement. So you can get that report from the print option at the bottom. I'm just going to close out of this screen now because I've entered all of the required details. And when we come to process our payroll, the statutory maternity pay will now calculate automatically. So that was one of the ways to enter the maternity details. The other way you could do it is to enter details directly in the employee record. Now I'll show you where, because I've already entered them in the quick SMP screen, it will have filled in the details for me. But if I go into the employee record for this employee and click on the absence tab, at the bottom of the absence diary, you've got this option for SMP. And when I go into here, this is another place where you can fill in the due date, born on date, last day of work, so ended work for MPP, and the average earnings. So if you're going in via this option, you will need to click Auto Calc in order to calculate those average earnings. You would tick the box to say you've received the medical evidence. You can check the calculation of the average earnings on the 8 weeks gross tab. And there's also a section showing you the entitlement. So that's that same table we saw in the quick SMP screen. And it also shows you any SMP previously paid and what's currently due up to your current process date. So for me, maternity pay period starts on the 21st of September, and up to my September pay date, it's about 1.5 weeks, 1.43 weeks, which is being calculated at the higher rate. So you can, if you prefer, enter the details directly in the employee record, or you can go through the recording maternity link. Now, once you've entered the details, we can move back onto our payroll tasks. And if you set your process date, so the employee's pay date, in this case, 30th of September, you can then check that the SMP payment appears within the enter payment screen. So I've just got that one person highlighted. I'll open up enter payments. At the moment, I've got the full salary entered, but we'll come back to adjusting that a little bit later on. But to check the SMP, you'd go onto the summary tab at the top here, and you would see the statutory maternity pay that's been calculated. So this is what is due up to the process date. And if you ever want to check the breakdown of that amount, you can click onto it, and you can click this drop down arrow, and that takes you straight into the maternity details screen in the employee record. And if you click on the entitlement tab here at the top, this is our breakdown. So it's 1.43 weeks, and we know that it's part of the first 6 weeks, so it's calculated at this higher rate. So I'm happy that the details are entered and that the SMP is being calculated. So let's just recap where we're up to now, and then we'll move on to adjusting the payments. So that's the information you need: the date the employee wants to start their leave. So he needs to know the last day of work, and then the medical evidence with the due date. So we entered the information in the quick SMP screen using the recording maternity link, or alternatively, you can enter it in the employee record. And then the next step there is we went into the enter payment screen, click the summary tab, just to check that the SMP appears within the summary. And to see that breakdown, if you want to drill down in that total, you can click on the drop down arrow and you can select the entitlement tab to see anything previously paid and currently due. So that's your setup. What we'll look at next is adjusting your employees' payments. Now, as you've just seen, the statutory payment is calculated automatically, and that will continue right up until the last day of the paid maternity leave. But you will need to make some adjustments to your employees' other payments. And the way that you do this would depend on whether or not you have a company maternity scheme where you're going to pay your employee more than the statutory amount, or whether there's any payments you need to make them for work that they've done within that period. So we're going to rejoin the demo. Just bring the slides down. We'll go back to full screen. And we're going to take a look at adjusting the payments for our employee on maternity leave. So if I just go back into the enter payment screen, we've already seen that the statutory maternity pay has calculated on the summary tab. But what I'm now going to do is make an adjustment to the salary. And for this first example, I'm going to use the make up basic option because I want my employee to receive their full salary amount, which is £2,000 in this example, but it will be made up of the statutory maternity pay and then topped up with salary. So make up basic is really simple to use. You start by entering the full amount of payments you want the employee to receive. So I've just entered £2,000 on the payments tab. And then if you click onto the summary tab, you can then click make up basic here at the bottom of the screen. And it will tell you you've selected make up basic. And to do this, the hours or number value of salary will need to be reduced. So it'll pick the first payment in your list. If it's a different payment that you want to adjust, you can keep clicking no until it shows you the payment you do want to adjust. But it is salary that I want to reduce. So I'm going to click yes. And you'll see there that the pre-tax payment has reduced. The total gross pay is now the £2,000 salary amount. And clicking back to the payments, I can see that the hours or number value has reduced, which has adjusted the amount of the salary. And you can repeat that step in any period where there's a specific amount that you want to make up to. So next month, if I still want them to receive full salary, I would enter the full salary. I would come to the summary tab, and whatever the maternity pay is next month, I can use make up basic to do the adjustment. Now, if you don't have a company maternity scheme and you only want to pay them the SMP for the period that they've been off, you'll need to do a manual adjustment to the salary, and then you'll be reducing it to 0 after this period. And the way that you would do this is kind of similar to how you would deal with new starters that join you partway through a period, or employees that leave and don't work for the full month or week. So let's give you an example. This employee normally gets £2,000 as a salary. I know that they started their maternity leave after working 15 days in September, so work 5 days a week. So I'm going to adjust their salary just to pay them for the 15 days that they worked. And there were a total of 21 working days in this month. Now, there are different ways that you can work out a part period salary. This is just an example. You should follow your usual process when it comes to adjusting payments for a part period. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use this little calculator option in the hours or number to enter 15 divided by 21. That will then reduce down the salary to the amount I want to pay them for the 15 days they worked. And then on the summary tab, the statutory maternity pay is being added to that. So a couple of different ways that you might approach adjusting the payments. Check with your employee's contract if you're unsure whether they're entitled to any kind of company maternity pay. Now, one other thing that you may need to consider when adjusting payments is pension contributions. The employer contribution is usually maintained at the amount it would have been before any statutory payment, so based on their normal salary. And if your pension scheme requires you to maintain pension contributions at that level and you're reducing your employee's pay, you can amend the pension contribution to be a fixed amount for the duration of the maternity leave. So one way we could do this is to click onto the employee button, which gets us straight into the employee record. If you go to the pensions tab, you can then manage your pension schemes. If you edit the pension for this individual employee, you can, if you need to, set the employer contribution to a fixed amount. So if I wanted to maintain the employer contribution at £44.40, which is what I'm usually paying, that can be entered as a fixed amount rather than a percentage. And it just means that when the pay reduces to nothing and they're just getting SMP, the employer pension will remain the same. So I've done that there, and I can see the employer's pension is now showing the £44.40. So let's just complete the pay run for this employee. I'll show you a couple of reports. So looking at pay slips, statutory payments always have their own line in the payment section of a pay slip. So it'll have the label parental pay, and it will show the calculated statutory pay amount. And then the salary in this case is the amount that I adjusted manually. And then we still have the usual deductions for tax, national insurance and pension. And we have our employee's net pay at the bottom. Parental payments are also shown separately on the payment summary reports. So if I just run payment summary part 1 for this employee, you can see our parental payments has a value just here. So I would then complete my payroll in the usual way, running update records. And then you would send your full payment submission, which will report your liabilities. So this FPS is just sending over the tax, national insurance and student loans for the employees included in this pay run. But it doesn't actually include any information around the statutory payment you've recovered, as that's something that you will deal with at the end of each tax month. So that's payroll complete for that period. Let's just recap those steps before we move on to reclaiming the statutory pay. So one way to adjust an employee's payment if you want to pay them their usual salary is to use Make-up Basic. So for this step, you enter the full amount they want to receive in the Payments tab, and then if you go to Summary, you can then click Make-up Basic. Other way to do it is using a manual adjustment. So you do the calculation manually of what you want to pay them for the time that they've worked, and then you can either adjust the hours or number, or you could adjust the rate to pay them that specific amount. And then next month, if they're only on maternity leave, they haven't done any work, you could reduce the salary down to 0. The other thing that we covered there is pension adjustments. So employer pension contributions are usually based on an employee's normal pay during periods of maternity leave. If you're unsure, you should always check with your pension provider or HMRC. And if the pay has reduced, but you need to maintain the employer contribution, you can override it with a fixed amount, which you can do within the employee record. Right, so moving on to reclaiming statutory payments. In the introduction, I think we explained that you can reclaim at least 92% of the statutory pay, statutory parental pay that you've paid out. Or if you qualify for small employers relief, you get 103%. The way this works is as an adjustment at the end of the tax month. So when you run your P32 report to calculate the payment due, that will then itemise any statutory payments you've recovered, and those amounts will be deducted from the tax and national insurance that you were due to pay over. So you're offsetting the amount you've reclaimed against the payment that you're making. Now, because that reclaim amount is not included in the full payment submission, you also need to do an employer payment summary, an EPS submission at the end of the month to inform HMRC that you've made a reclaim. Now, the EPS is a monthly submission. If you pay your staff weekly, you do your FPS each week, but you wait until the end of the month until you report the reclaimed amounts. So I just want to show you the report and the submission in the demo. So let's just switch back to payroll. I've already updated records and sent my FPS for tax month 6. So next step is to run the P32. And again, I'm going to do that from my payroll links, but you'll also find this within the main reports option. So the tax month that I'm running the report for is month 6 to 6. So that's the values I've got in the criteria. And if I just zoom in slightly for you, you can see this report has totaled the PAYE income tax, any student or postgraduate loan deductions, and gross national insurance. But then it's got the amounts I've recovered for SMP, which was the full amount of SMP plus the NIC compensation, which is a total of 103% of what I paid out. Now what that means, the total amount due has been reduced, and I need to report this reclaim by sending an EPS. So this is what I pay over, and to submit the reclaim, I can either use the link for employer payment summary here within the payroll tasks, or you can go to e-submissions and you'll find it from here as well. You select the option at the top to say that you're adjusting your payment because you've recovered statutory pay. Check the tax month. It's showing the correct tax month. In this case, it's tax month 6. It will then display any statutory payments that you have recovered in the tax year to date. So if there was a previous reclaim this tax year, it'll show those values as well. It'll be the kind of cumulative values. There is a box for CIS deductions suffered, which can be entered manually if that applies to you. And apprenticeship levy payments that you might be due to make would be displayed here. So you complete this wizard. You'll not see this warning. This is just because I'm in a training room. So you can ignore that, but you will see the employer payment summary submission. And you would just work through, checking your details, checking the tax year and references. And if you're happy with everything, you'd go ahead and click submit. So that then submits the reclaim value, which will update in your PAYE online account. And then you would simply make the payment that was due to HMRC. So those are the month-end tasks, running the P32 to check the amount that you're reclaiming, and then submitting the EPS to report those reclaim values. Deadline for that submission is the 19th of the following month. So we're going to finish the webinar today with some troubleshooting for SMP. And I'm going to start this with probably the most common problem that people come across when dealing with SMP. And that is when you're trying to set it up for an employee that has received SMP in the past. So if an employee has had SMP before, there is certain information that is still recorded in their employee record, including the number of weeks of SMP that has been paid. Now that information needs to be cleared removed, reset, and there's a few ways that you can actually do that. But if you don't clear the information first, if you just change the dates of the maternity leave, you'll find that no SMP is calculated because it still thinks that 39 weeks have been paid. So there's two ways you can deal with this. If you go through the quick SMP screen, you'll see a pop-up message to tell you that you've already paid SMP to this employee in the past. And then it'll ask you whether you want to reset those values or whether you just want to view them. So that message on the left-hand side is what comes up. Always be a bit cautious when you see that, because if you're in the middle of paying SMP, you don't want to clear the information. You're likely just to want to view it. But if you are setting up for the first time, the employee's had it before, you can click yes, and that will reset everything. It's just a case of entering the details again. The alternative is to overwrite the existing details, but then go into the year-to-date values and remove the weeks paid previously. So I want to show you a quick demo of this one. So if I just switch back over to payroll. So I'm onto my next pay date now, which is 31st of October. I have another employee who's going on maternity leave. So I've selected them in the list. I click recording maternity. And for this one, I'm getting a pop-up. So this tells me I've already paid it to the employee. And do I want to record details for a second child? Now, if you're unsure, the safest thing to do is to click no. And that allows you to view the current SMP details. And I can see here that, yeah, this is old information. This was the last time she was on maternity leave back in 2017, and I'm going to need to clear that information. So I'm not going to overwrite it here because within the employee record, I just show you the year-to-date values, which can be found on the employment tab. Within the statutory payment section, we have 39 weeks of SMP previously paid. And if I'm just overwriting the dates, it's not going to remove those 39 weeks. Now, I could remove them manually by setting this to 0 and then entering the new dates in the SMP area of the employee record. But an easier way to deal with it, once I've established that that's old information that I want to clear, is to click record in maternity and then click yes. That lets you enter everything from scratch. So I'm going to pop in the due date, employee's last day of work. I can see all the entitlement figures. I can save these details. And then if I go back into the record, I'm just going to show you those year-to-date values again. You can see that the SMP has now been cleared. So when I go to enter payments and I check the SMP amount, I can see that that's appearing just as I would expect it to. But if it's showing 0 and they've had SMP before, it's very likely to be because they still have the number of weeks from their previous child in their year-to-dates. So I just wanted to show you that one. Quick SMP is a good way to get around it. Or you could remove the weeks paid in the year-to-date values. A couple of other reasons as well for no SMP calculating. So it could be that average earnings are too low. So it's worth going into the quick SMP screen and checking the average earnings, see what figures displayed, see what payments that was made up of. And another reason why it might not calculate is if you've got the manual statutory pay calculations box ticked. So that's found in the employee record. You can either clear that in the employee record and enter the maternity details, or if you go through the quick SMP screen, you'll be told if that manual box is ticked and you'll be asked if you want to reset that. So a couple of top tips there, troubleshooting no SMP. And just to finish off, if you've set up your SMP but the amount is less than what you're expecting, two things I'd suggest that you check. So number one, have you entered the correct process date? So this should match the date the employee is paid. And the statutory payment will calculate up to that date. Now what this might mean in practice is that the first or last payment might be slightly lower or higher than expected, because if you usually pay your employee up to the end of the month, but they're paid, say, on the 25th, the way that the SMP would work is it will work out the SMP to the 25th of the current month. So the first payment might be a bit lower than what you'd expect. And then when you get to the end of the maternity leave, the last payment will be a little bit higher because it will be catching up on the last few days of the previous month. So make sure you've got the right process date entered, and just keep in mind that SMP calculates up to that date. And another reason why it might be lower than expected when it comes to the standard rate of SMP is if 90% of average weekly earnings is lower than the standard amount. So the higher rate is 90% of average weekly earnings. The standard rate is 184.03 per week, or 90% of average earnings if that's lower. So if the rate has stayed the same and it's less than 184.03, that is the reason why. So that's about it for the webinar. I do want to take you through some further support, and we'll also stay online just to make sure we've answered as many questions as possible for you guys. I just want to start with some of the webinars that are coming up later this month. So we have a session on paternity pay next week with Alice, and we have one on shared parental pay. We have webinars on online pay slips, pensions the basics, and mastering mistakes. And we've also got a series of pensions webinars lined up for October as well. So you can find all the details on our website, sage.co.uk/webinars, or click the register now link in your handout. Also want to make you aware of a brand new service that we're now offering. It's our one-to-one bespoke training. So you can book time with one of our Sage experts to go through a training course tailored to your needs. So examples of training you might want is admin automation, training on the pensions module, or if you're a new payroll administrator and you just want a bit of support with getting up and running and getting used to your Sage 50 payroll, we can now book you in for a one-to-one training session. For details and prices, do reach out to our email address, ukisageuniversity@sage.com. Further help can also be found on our help centre at sage.co.uk/help. Just follow the links for Sage 50 payroll, or click any of the help icons in your programme and it will take you to the same place. It's also where you can find contact details for our support team. So choose the topic you need help with and click the Get in Touch link. And another fantastic learning resource is Sage University. You can access that at sageu.com. Once you've created your profile, find your way to the Sage 50 payroll learning path, and then you can complete e-learning at your own pace, certification, and bite-sized learning on a number of topics. So a great learning resource available for you guys free of charge. So just a couple of minutes left in the scheduled time, but we will try to stick around if there are questions to be answered, and Alison and myself will be answering those in the chat. Just a reminder that if you'd like a copy of the handouts, you'll need to download those before you leave. So click on the piece of paper icon to grab them. We'll send you a follow-up email after the webinar, which contains a link to the recording of this session. So do look out for that in your inbox later this afternoon. And as you leave the webinar, we will invite you to take our webinar survey, and it would be great if you could spare a moment just to let us know what you thought of today's session and any ideas that you might have to improve webinars or new topics moving forward. We do read all of your comments. We find them invaluable, helping us to keep these relevant and the best they can be for you guys. So I'm going to go on to mute briefly just to help out with any remaining questions. Once we're through them, I'll come back to do our goodbyes. So I shall speak to you in a few moments. Hello again, everyone, and thank you so much for sending those questions through. And well, we've gone over time, but we did want to get out as many answers as possible to your questions. Quick reminder to complete the survey as you leave, if you wouldn't mind. We really do appreciate any feedback that you might have, and do look out for the follow-up email arriving later today. As I think we've now managed to answer the majority of the questions, I just want to thank you all again for your time this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and we look forward to seeing you on some of our other webinars in the future. From myself and Alice and all the team here at Sage, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next one. Goodbye for now.